So it's my pleasure to introduce Graham Bishop. Many of us know Graham from his emails, weekly emails, the weekly grid of European parliamentary activities, which are always worth looking through and reading. Graham has been very active within the European movement. He has been 10 years on the executive committee and is at present the chair of the National Council of the European Movement. When he was working in the city at Solomon and Citigroup, he was instrumental in research on monetary union back in the 1980s and 1990s. And at the moment, he is a member of the board of the Kangaroo Group, and he's been a member for that for over 15 years. This is a group made up of European members of parliament, members of the Commission, the Council, academia, who are looking at ways of progressing the European Union through stability of the euro, implementation of the internal market, and the stability of the euro, and the realization of a community security and defense policy. Now, I was quite surprised. I thought, why is it called the Kangaroo? But then I thought it seems to be a group that is a sort of a thinking tank that seems to leap over boundaries that other people have brought in and find new thoughts and new ideals. And also it has, like Australian marsupials, a small pouch. It doesn't cost the European movement very much money. So it's a bonus for them to have such a group. And it's a bonus for us to have Graham here this evening. So I'll pass over to you, Graham. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Thanks for that kind introduction. I should just say the Kangaroo Group, the founders 30 years ago created the idea of the single market. So that's single market in goods, services, and capital, which is what we're about. So that's why I'm so keen on it. Anyway, so the topic today is Brexit ending the city's dominance of European finance, ? And I'm going to split my remarks into three parts, really. First of all, talk about diverging interests. Secondly, briefly about the relative size of the EU and the UK. And then thirdly, about some consequences. And then at the end, I'm actually going to advertise a poll, which I've got on my Twitter and LinkedIn pages. So I'd be very interested to hear your reactions. So let's go, first of all, diverging interests driving a wedge between the UK and the EU. I think many people will be aware of Lord Palmerston's dictum in days gone by, 200 years ago, about nations have no permanent friends or allies, just permanent interests. So that's why I thought I would analyze what's going on with the EU and the UK in terms of where are the interests, how are they developing, and are they going to diverge or are they going to converge? Because at the moment, until very recently, we were the same thing, but we're not now. So first of all, let's look at the EU's agenda for Europe. Now, this is the manifesto, I think is probably the right word, that Ursula von der Leyen was elected on by the co-legislators. Can I be heard all right? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you should be fine, Graham. I can hear you.
Let me see if I can turn up. No, if I try and turn it up, I'll lose it. Okay, I'll try and speak a bit more loudly. Yes, so Agenda for Europe is the manifesto that Ursula von der Leyen and the current commissioners were elected on by the European Parliament and the European Council. So it's not surprising, therefore, that they set about implementing that. And this test here, the Agenda for Europe, for the period up to 2024, a strong and integrated resilient capital market is the best starting point for the single currency to become ever more widely used internationally. That is the basic message as far as monetary union is concerned. There are lots of other stuff as well, of course. Now that was followed through by DG FISMA, Financial Markets Directorate of the Commission, with their strategic plan on how to implement it. And when you look at the list of consultations that they have up since the new commission started, it's about 19. So that is going to cover virtually every aspect of the European Union's financial system. Will be picked up, looked at, turned over, and maybe changed, maybe not. Add in the green agenda on top of that. And I think it's reasonable, it's a racing certainty actually, that most components of the EU's financial system is going to be changed by the time we get to 2024. So that's a reasonable time horizon for what we're looking at. Now, either at this stage, either we go along with that, these changes that they make to their system, in which case we have become a vassal, we are taking their rules, or we diverge. And so I would, I've sort of looked at some of the comments made by Chancellor Sunak, and made this to Parliament a little while ago. Brexit now enables Britain to start doing things differently and better in terms of regulation. He then went on to say, he added that people were free to call it Big Bang 2.0 or whatever. So that suggests to me very strongly that there is going to be major changes by the UK in the way its rules are run. The governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, told the Treasury Select Committee that he would take it as a very bad thing for us to become a rule taker, and if there are consequences, so be it. So there's a fairly clear message to everyone that the UK is going to change, and change to suit its own account, not the interests of Europe. So this is why I talk about a wedge being driven between the UK and the EU. Now, one of the constraints on our freedom of action is in the Treaty on Cooperation and the TCA, Article 5.41. We did agree to use our best endeavours to implement international standards from BIS, IOSCO, etc. So that does put a certain constraint on our freedom of manoeuvre, but I don't think very much. And when you think about this government's willingness to break treaties it's just negotiated, I don't think we can think of that as any great deterrent. So that's the central point, is I've identified the two sets of interests of the EU and the UK. They're going to get forced apart by the UK's specific actions. So let's go on to the next slide, if we can, Andy. Yes, there we are. Just think about the relative size. And again, while we're talking about historical maxims, the Duke of Wellington used to talk about God is on the side of the big battalions. And I think this slide shows you who's the big battalion here. Until we left, we were part of EU 28, which was second only in size to the US. We were a major player, very influential, particularly in financial services, very influential player in shaping the rules to suit us, frankly. And there you see the relative size of the populations and then the GDP. And I then put up investment assets. We're talking about financial markets. The EU 28 is 25 trillion, not billion, trillion of financial assets. Now that's leaving aside bank deposits. They're not in this calculation. European savers tend to go for bank deposits, whereas UK savers go much more for equities and funds. So you can see the relative size of the markets, and the size of what we've got in the UK investment assets. Half of that, or a third of it, out of the total, is foreign assets, sovereign wealth funds, and so forth. So there is a major imbalance in the size of the two players here. The EU is huge. We are much, much smaller, fifth, sixth of the size, depending how you measure it. And the EU has made it very clear that they're going to pay attention only to their own interests and not to anybody else's. And frankly, why would they pay attention to anyone else's? So let's go on then and talk about some of the consequences which might flow from this. So if we could, Andy, if you can move on to the next slide. Yes, here we are. Now, first thing is, I don't believe there's going to be a comprehensive equivalence finding between the EU and the UK. Now, equivalence, let's just define our terms, is in fact set out in the TCA and is based on the outcome. So you have, it's not word by word in the regulations, it's taking the regulations, the texts, and how they're going to be operated and the systems to operate them. Is the outcome the same? And the EU has put in absolutely explicitly that they may give equivalence when it is in the EU's interest, full stop. So this is entirely a unilateral, we have given equivalence in many ways to them, but they have not reciprocated so far. And in my view, they probably won't. And that's what we'll come to. Now, some of the immediate consequences, the trading of EU shares used to be done largely in London. It went almost immediately to the EU and actually to Amsterdam. Some derivatives trading has already gone from the UK to the EU and some to the US. But as far as the EU is concerned, what goes to the US, they're not particularly concerned about. And I'll come in a moment to what they are concerned about is the stability of the EU's financial system. So there is a temporary central counterparty equivalence. I won't try and describe that in any detail, but the financial markets, the liquidity of the financial markets is very heavily determined by the amount of trading in derivatives, in particular interest rate derivatives. So when people talk about the liquidity of financial markets, derivatives are key, and they are run through CCPs to a large extent, or a rising extent. So there is at the moment a temporary agreement by the EU that the two big CCPs in the UK will be regarded as equivalent to those in the EU. That runs out in mid-22, in 18 months. So when that does, will it be renewed? Should it be renewed? And if not, what are the consequences? And I think it's quite interesting to look at the scale. What is often forgotten is that the size of the euro-denominated derivatives market, if you're talking about the notional amount outstanding, it's 130 trillion against, you remember, our nearly 3 trillion of GDP. Even if you net that down to gross replacement values, you're still talking about 5 trillion. So these are huge numbers in relation to the size of the UK. And so they will be thinking, and are thinking, not will be, are thinking, if they leave that amount of risk in the UK outside their own jurisdiction, is that safe? Can they regard that as a safe and stable mechanism? And I will just quote to you a few remarks recently made by ECB Director Panetta. And again, these are deeply technical matters, but with huge political and economic consequences. Both this speech and another one I'm going to quote to you a bit, and neither of these were covered in the UK media at all, as far as I can see. But the ECB has made it very clear that they are, industry stakeholders are encouraged to reduce their exposure to UK CCPs. This is a straight matter of policy to do this. And at the moment, the two CCPs in the UK are subject to ESMA's supervision by agreement with us, of course. So the reason they're equivalent is because the EU is actually looking over them at the moment. But afterwards, or during this period, the Securities Market Authority in Europe is going to examine it to see whether it's sufficient to address the risks to the EU's financial stability. Now, part of the ECB's responsibility, the European Central Bank's responsibility, is financial stability. So they will be looking as well, separately from the Securities Market Authority, to see if the outcome of this is a safe and sensible and stable situation. Even if ESMA recommends to the Commission to deny the UK CCP's recognition equivalence in the future, the ECB will have its own views. And so they will think about this. But what they have said is if these CCPs come into the EU, into the EU's jurisdiction, and therefore the ECB's. That is a huge increase in risks, and the existing legislation would not be fit for purpose. A very strong statement. So what we're looking at here is one of the major planks of the UK's, of the cities to be more exact, trading power, the liquidity in the derivatives market, and in particular the euro-denominated derivatives, that is up for grabs. And as I have been reading the ECB's policy, and speaking to them, obviously, the ECB's policy development over the years, you can see that the line of development of the policies, straight as a die, going towards having control over and through location of the CCPs directly under the legislative jurisdictional control of the ECB. So in my view, when you look at what Panetta has said and what the chairman of the ESMA's CCP committee has also just been saying earlier in the week, they are going to look at these things very, very carefully. And I must say, I assume that the outcome will be that there will be a lot of pressure on EU traders and asset managers to have their derivatives located in the EU's jurisdiction, and therefore that will move out of London. Now, what happens to the dollar derivatives, whether they stay in London or go to New York, who knows? But as far as the EU is concerned, it isn't a calculation about what are the tax revenues and that sort of thing. It's, is there a risk to their financial system which is too great to leave outside their jurisdiction? So that is going to be one of the big consequences. And as that develops, then a lot of things will happen, and we will see people moving, tax revenues moving, as the balance sheets which support these huge amounts of derivatives, as they move, we will see a big swing in tax revenues. Now, at the beginning, Richard said that the city, was it Richard or Andy, said that the city generates a huge amount of tax revenue for the UK. At the last count on the City of London Corporation's calculation, so I'm sure Mark will agree with that, the calculation was 76 billion of tax revenues. That's about 10% of the UK's total tax revenues. Now, how much is going to go? Who can say? And clearly, Nationwide Building Society and such like, and Lloyds Bank will stay completely in the UK and be generating their normal amount of profits, hopefully, and taxes that go on that, and their employees. So we're not talking about this being drastically cut, but to give you a flavour of the magnitude, if the city's tax contribution were halved, something of that sort, then to replace it would be the equivalent of raising the basic income tax rate from 20 to 28p. Now, people may say, bankers producing 76 billion of tax revenues, who knows about that? They don't realize it pays for hospitals all over the place and so on. But if it suddenly came to the situation where to maintain that level of public spending, there would have to be a big rise in taxes generally. And I quote the basic rate of income tax as being a totemic measure. But if that had to change by this sort of order of magnitude, then people would really begin to realize that the loss of the city, or loss of a significant chunk of the city, has a real consequence for the UK. There's a massive significance. So I'll stop at that and hope that I've triggered a little bit of interest. But Andy, if you can move on, yes. I've just put my my LinkedIn name and my Twitter handle, so that I've put up a poll there, just simply saying, do you think I'm being too pessimistic, yes or no? I'd be very interested in what people have to say. The poll's open for 3 days, and I recently did a video for the Federal Trust, short video, which has got over nearly 17,000 views, and the likes and dislikes are running at 600 to 20. So that's 30 to 1 likes about what I'm saying. So I was quite heartened that I'm not preaching entirely in the dark. Anyway, on that note, I'll stop and look forward to some comments.
Thank you very much indeed, Graham. That's very informative, and I think, from my perspective anyway, absolutely horrifying. I wonder if, first of all, I could ask Mark to comment. whether he agrees with all of that, or there are things that he'd like to add. Does he see that as a worst case scenario? And perhaps also, you know, it seems that if we get into this mess, it's kind of a one-way travel, isn't it? Because you're unlikely to ever get this back, which is perhaps part of the problem we have with the manufacturing sector where I am. You know, once you lose your car manufacturing, it's not coming back. So I'd just like to get your sort of perspective on it, Mark, please.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Graham. I agree entirely with the analysis. And it was very predictable, I might say. This could have been written a couple of years ago, and indeed was by a number of people, I think Graham and me included. Britain has taken decisions on equivalence in Britain's interests because we wish to keep business that is in London in London. Europe has taken decisions in its interests because it wants business currently in London to be in the European Union. And to me, that is entirely predictable. Now, it can be argued that the European economy will lose if a lot of financial services business shifts to the European Union. That is correct, but it's marginal. And the European Union countries have decided they would rather have control and a slightly less efficient wholesale financial markets than having very efficient financial markets and less control. I think the expression taking back control comes to mind here. So we should not be at all surprised at what has happened. Just quickly on equivalence generally, the media still keep talking about an equivalence decision. Oh. I think the number is 69, but it's very high. There is not a single equivalence decision. The European Union has provision for equivalence in a number of its directives. It has to be on a case-by-case basis. We said 5 years ago, these are taken on political grounds, ask the Swiss. They're not taken on economic grounds. So what's happening is predictable. And I think business, the derivatives business, will over time shift to Amsterdam, which, let us remind ourselves, 400 years ago was one of the great cities of the world, probably a bigger commercial centre than London.
Yes, I mean, some people are saying though that, you know, that the exodus has so far been slower than we predicted, and
as one of the people who made the predictions, I think they're exactly in line with what we predicted. The work that we commissioned from a firm of consultants, and Graham has partly referred to that. The worst case scenario we predicted was the loss of something like 35,000 jobs. And because of the effects on the ecosystem, perhaps another 35. Nobody ever said this would happen before we left the single market. You know, this is the long-term effect. And what's been measured so far are jobs that have been moved. What we have not measured is the jobs that would have come to us, the expansion that would have happened. Yes. You know, I'm aware of businesses that stopped expanding in London after the referendum result. So I think the predictions of what has happened are being exactly borne out in practice.
Thank you. Nick, would you like to come in here and comment on what you've heard so far?
Okay, thanks, Andy, and thanks for all your work in setting this up, and indeed thanks to Graham. Mine was just a quick remark and I suppose question. I know, of course, Graham said that Brexit is billed as Big Bang 2. Well, if anything, there's a considerable mismatch between the original Big Bang and this so-called Big Bang, and maybe I could draw a comparison or the case as standard in the insurance industry. The Prudential Regulation Authority has basically said that there will be no watering down of provisions in that industry. So if one of the major benefits of Brexit was supposed to be divergence and setting our own rules, that does not seem to be the case. So that rather raises the issue, what's the point of Brexit? But you didn't mention, the question is really, maybe you could find a point to setting rules in these areas, and perhaps you could speculate on the outlook for the insurance sector, Graham.
Well, the insurance sector is a Solvency II is a piece of legislation, and they have some very specific grouses about, I forget the exact details of it, but the the Bank of England, I suppose, is their regulator, has said that they will be looking at it, that there will be no wholesale reduction in the requirement of capital. So there's not going to be, if some of the Brexiteers who are in the insurance industry thought they were going to get a big slash of their capital requirements, they're going to be sadly disappointed. I just have the floor for a moment, Mark?
Yeah.
I forgot to mention about the Memorandum of Understanding, which is being negotiated at the moment. We had hoped when we set the date for this that it would have been already agreed so we could talk about the facts, but we can't, not quite. But that is, until a while ago, a number of British commentators were saying, this is going to be the vehicle for agreeing a marvelous quantity of equivalence findings, and this is the pathway through for the city. That was never the case. And as with so often, these people don't bother to read the texts of the treaties. And if you do, you'll see that the EU was very clear that it was just going to be about the arrangements to discuss, a list of the telephone numbers and names of people to ring if there's a problem, and maybe some committees to set up, though the committees which were meant to have been set up under the TCA on other matters have not even, I don't think they've met or even been appointed yet. So this is going to be something, it's merely about, if we want to chat, here it is, this is the mechanism. But is it about, let's agree on what the regulations are going to be in the future? Absolutely not. The EU has been absolutely crystal clear that that is not on the agenda. They will decide on their rules for their own best interests as they see fit, full stop.
Mark, you wanted to come in, I think.
Two things. Agree entirely with Graham on that point. The MOU, which I think will be agreed next week, is setting a framework for discussions. Yes. And that's always been clear and a lot of wishful thinking. On insurance, this is an interesting one because there were differing views as to whether the problems the industry referred to were caused by the directive or by the British implementation of the directive. And often it's the latter. And it was never clear. However, Sam Woods, I think, in the last 2 days has said to the insurance industry, don't expect radical changes. In the past, we've tended to blame the European Union for lots of things. I think the classic was in another area recently where I saw some commentators say that because we had left the European Union, we can now change our laws so that we could compete more effectively with Luxembourg, which is a member of the European Union.
Oh dear. Right, well, let's get into some of the questions that are coming in, and just to remind everyone that you are in listen only mode, so the way that you communicate with us is via the Q&A where the questions should be put, although several questions are coming in through the chat as well, and I will try to keep my eyes on both. There's a simple single one-liner here from Rajesh Gupta, which doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be easy to answer. And it says, how can one get the government and especially Sunak to see what you see, Graham?
Well, I think you need a new chancellor. I mean, that's it. I mean, they just don't see it, and never have. And despite Mark's valiant efforts when he was in charge of the city's politics, the Brexiteers have never understood it. They think it's all about tax revenues and the like. It isn't. Yes, of course, the EU would like to have some of the tax revenues, but the one thing they do want is to make sure our CCPs don't explode them. And that is absolutely core. Financial stability is the very core of what they're after. And they'll get the tax revenues anyway, bit by bit, as Mark was saying. The new jobs will come. The equivalence questions will die away, because as companies discover that it's not going to happen, then they've sunk costs in building their new place in Amsterdam or Frankfurt or Paris. Whatever then happens, bearing in mind that TCA itself is renewable every 5 years, so it may just disappear. how many companies, having spent a lot of money, shifted a lot of people, I see somebody in the chat has been moved to Amsterdam, they're not going to be moved back. So the sunrise industries will be built over there. And the sunset industries live in London.
Yeah, I'd be slightly kinder to ministers. I think the Treasury understand the position pretty well.
Right.
However, looking at this politically, what has been the political problem caused by Brexit and financial services? Answer, none. The financial services industry is operating brilliantly. The customer has not noticed, so what is the problem? This is unlike fish, where fishermen are losing jobs. It is unlike manufacturing, and I just heard today on another call, I was in an American company employing 51 more staff to deal with European bureaucracy. An ambassador saying all of his time is spent on sorting out supply chain issues. These are real job losses now. They are visible and they are political. What's happened on financial services is the proverbial frog boiling. Politically, it is not an issue. And that's why it did not have the priority that economic logic suggests it should have done.
But will do over time.
The costs will come home to roost in due course.
Correct.
On a time scale like 4 or 5 years.
Right, next question was, can the EU raise sufficient capital for EU companies without the UK?
Well, go back to my chart about the size. The size of investment assets, which are invested through mutual funds, through UCITS and what have you, into bonds and equities, 25 trillion of it, less our side. Yeah, there's a lot of money there. All we are still, is the intermediary. The savings which buy the bonds, buy the equities, etc., those come from the savers of the EU, and they will continue to. So it's the intermediation which may get shifted, but not the savings. The savings are those of European citizens. And there's a lot of it, 25 trillion up.
And there's nothing stopping European corporates raising money in London anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of questions which are sort of looking to see what we can make that's positive out of the city. One's in the chat and one's in the Q&A, so I'll take them both. From the chat, from Deborah, it says, as much as one doesn't like it, we are where we are with Brexit. Surely we have to be focusing on some sort of modus vivendi with Europe on financial services. Are there any positive things to say about the future of the city? And along with that, from Robert Morland, if the UK goes for very light regulation and low tax re the city, will it make a difference?
Well, Robert, the EU is not going to go for light regulation. I think you can take that as absolute certain. Don't forget the financial crisis of the great financial crash of 2007-9. They think that was largely because the city was not in control, and that cost them, I seem to remember the number was 11 million jobs at the time. And so the entire tsunami of regulations which has come since the great financial crash is not about to be reversed, far from it. So I think we needn't worry about that. Deborah's comments, question about anything positive we can say. I can't. I mean, at the margin, you might find some small firms in the UK servicing UK clients may find they have a little less regulation if they're small firms. But when you come to the organisations which are generating the billions of tax, there's nothing which is going to keep them here.
I quickly agree entirely on regulation. The government's made it very clear it's not going to deregulate. I can remember the Chancellor speaking at the Mansion House dinner a few years ago, saying European regulation is not enough. We have gone further. So nothing will happen. again, I can't see much on the bright side in respect of the EU. We've got to recognise, as the question said, we're out of it. And like other businesses, one has to adapt. And we are very strong in many areas. You've got Ron Khalifa's excellent report on fintech recently. We're very strong on legal services. We're still very strong on many financial services. But we need to say, well, how can we expand other markets? And to me, the essential things, immigration is a key to it. I think our immigration policy has been seriously damaging. We talk about allowing in very successful, prosperous entrepreneurs. The people who've been very successful often came in with nothing from European countries. And we have special visas, but they never seem to work. So if we need to be open to talent from around the world. Yes, we need to adapt our regulation. And you've got examples of that happening now. But each change in regulation requires a lot of hard work. And there hasn't been the bandwidth to deal with that because of Brexit. And now there's COVID. So significant changes like the ones that Lord Hill has proposed, can take a year or two to put into place. And one area I dealt with a few years ago, which was to do with pension funds, where because of what had been done, enabled what we did to do in London, not Luxembourg, took 2 years of hard work, consultation, analysis. So we need to look at our tax system, look at our regulatory system. What can we change that will benefit and get more business for Britain?
Can I just make a comment about legal services? They are one of our jewels in our crown. Will they remain so? This is a question which is hardly put, but I noticed for the first time recently, ESMA made a ruling that they would accept UK law in the prospectuses of certain types of bank bonds, because they're all going to run out in the next 5-10 years. But are they going to accept UK law, English law to be more exact, in future prospectuses? As far as I know, it's not yet settled. But of course they will think about using their own law, even if it's Luxembourg law or somewhere else, or Irish law for that matter. But will they want to have something, they don't want, or we don't want, I should say, to be subject to the ECJ? Do they want to find that their financial systems in the end are subject to the Supreme Court in London? I suspect the answer will be no. So again, these are things which take a while to work through. It's not a subject, I don't think, which is terribly live at the moment. I suspect it'll become so. Mark, you have
as always, Graham, I agree largely with you, but a little bit on the side. Most big commercial contracts are written in English law or New York law.
Yeah.
That applies anywhere in the world. But the question is, where is the legal work done? And English law can be done anywhere in the world. And similarly, the arbitration on English law can be done in Singapore, which has got a growing market. So I think, Graham, what's happening is that English law will still be extensively used.
Yeah.
But the lawyers doing the English law will increasingly be working for the big law firms, Linklaters and others, in the countries where the businesses are. Right. So if the business is based in Amsterdam or London, they may or Milan or Paris, they will be using lawyers working in Amsterdam, Paris, wherever. And that's where the income will be. I think that's probably a bigger risk than actually it not being done in English law.
Yeah.
Remains to be seen, as you say.
But presumably not English lawyers either, but does that mean there's a training aspect for lawyers overseas to get up to speed with English law, or are they there already?
Well, I think they're there already. And English law is so pervasive. If you want to be a serious corporate lawyer, you know all about English law, or New York law for that matter.
Or both.
Funds may well use Luxembourg law, given that so many of them are domiciled there. But we'll see how that evolves.
Okay, 2 more questions then that are linked. Can Boris Johnson and Tory Brexit government borrow their way out of trouble? Is that feasible? Because what other option is there? Well, you've mentioned some like fintech, and a similar question, where will Sunak make up the lost tax revenues, this 38 billion that Graham was talking about? plus everything else that we're losing in manufacturing and so on. Will we become Singapore Mark II? What would that look like?
Well, I'm not going to say about Singapore or anything, but the big question, we've just made a huge increase in our national debt. So is every other country. And I remember in the year of my birth, our debt GDP ratio was 250% of GDP. It's now a mere 100%. But it fell during Mrs. Thatcher's reign. It halved, and not by prudent fiscal policy and penny pinching and raising taxes and so on, but a couple of years of 25% inflation worked wonders for the real value of your debt. So yes, we can borrow our way out at the moment in the short run, but eventually the borrowings have to be repaid. And if you finish up, this is moving away from Brexit to sort of the economic questions. If you finish up getting a rise in the rate of inflation, which then calls forth a corresponding rise in the rate of interest, and that then feeds into the government debt portfolio, you have got a nightmare. And the simple way out of that is a good shot of inflation. And I remember the beginning of my career, gilt yields hit 17% as opposed to less than 1%. They can go back. Food for thought. I'm not that old, you know.
Mark, what would you like to say on that?
I agree, it's not a particular British problem. Britain can borrow at a very low rate at present. Inflation has always been the way that governments get out of debt problems. It works rather well. The tax thing, although the 76 billion, I recognise that figure, a lot of it's got nothing to do with international business. You know, a lot of it is purely domestic. I think that the tax loss that the Oliver Wyman study talked about, maximum was 10 billion. That is a far bigger problem from the government than financing its deficit long term, I think, because that is tax revenue that will have to be replaced. We've already seen one thing the government's done with corporation tax. It's freezing some tax allowances. Eventually it will have to do other things. I think they would like to do some sensible, but politically impossible things, like levying VAT on everything instead of having policies that help the rich, like exempting children's clothing and food. And they probably like to replace corporate taxes and rates by VAT. But those are politically dangerous things to do.
Well, we're getting told off by Deborah, who's still upset that we're not coming up with too much positive to say. So maybe we could try a little bit harder. Surely we could be working to change hearts and minds, if not change the government. And then where do we go to? She says, I'm sad that we don't seem to be offering anything positive. So let's put our thinking caps on. What can we do?
Well, I'd love to be able to say something positive. But the harsh reality is we have just thrown our largest export industry under the bus. And there's no getting away. I haven't talked at all about the current account deficit. The city, I mean, it's all muddled at the moment with COVID. The city used to generate more than 70 billion a year of foreign earnings. That is exactly what will disappear as all the derivatives traders, etc., all go, far more than the tax revenues. And without that, the international markets will look at it as a basket case. That's where you get the inflation from, and the currency goes down the drain, and then import prices pick up, etc., etc. And again, I have to say I've been around that loop at the beginning of my career, so I know it happens.
Yeah, I used to get fed up in the Brexit debate of being told to be positive. I want to be realistic.
Yes.
And I think one of the problems at present, what we're seeing happening in the manufacturing sector, as Graham knows perfectly well, could have been written 2 years ago. A consequence of leaving the single market was what is now happening. The Irish problem was known about. I can remember the previous Irish ambassador, telling us what would happen before the referendum.
Yeah.
And it's been exactly right. So, by not being honest, businesses have not prepared. Big businesses have. The financial sector, the figures I was seeing years ago was spending of 12 billion on Brexit preparations some years ago. And that's why the world has not noticed Brexit in respect of financial services. JP Morgan is operating exactly as it was before. It's just got several hundred more people not in Britain.
Yeah.
So let's be realistic. It doesn't mean we all have to say the world is going to end. The hit to the economy will be 4 or 5%. That's been predicted for some time, and I think that's probably right. You know, get over it. And I've talked about some of the things that can be done on financial services. I think we can do, you know, there's a lot of other things that can be done to make the economy more efficient. Regulation is one of my hobbies. I think we can do a huge amount to reduce the burden of regulation, which had nothing to do with the European Union, but there seems no appetite for that. I think we've done rather well on some trade deals, with scope for more to come, not with America in the short term.
Have we actually got any new trade deals or anything which we didn't have except when we were in the EU?
No, but I think it's been quite an effort just to try and roll over what we had.
Quite an effort to stay where we were.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, longer term, Graham, your thoughts might be helpful. We might think about rejoining the customs union or the single market, but not for some years, I suspect.
Well, the snag with, yes, we can think about it by all means, but the customs union, when you go back to the beginning of the EU and the single market, Lord Cockfield, who many people will remember as our commissioner in Margaret Thatcher's days, the single market was created in order to rectify the fact that the customs union was not enabling all sorts of a blossoming of industry and finance, because the non-tariff barriers were the problem. But as soon as you have the single market, then you have European rules which have to be uniform right the way across, that everyone is operating on the same level playing field. Then you have to have an enforcement mechanism. They call it the European Court of Justice. That's what the Brexiteers will never, ever agree to. So no, we will never join the single market under these circumstances. If we do, it'll actually be because we're a member of the European Union again.
Nick, you've been writing recently about the path to rejoin and the involvement of the possibility of actually rejoining the customs union as well. What's your take on the road back?
Right. Well, thank you, Andy. I mean, I think that the immediate battles are certainly ensuring that we diverge as little as possible from existing EU rules and arrangements such as they are. I think single market is very, very much the last step before rejoining. I think if there's a lot of talk about people wanting to rejoin EFTA, and I think that's rather mistaken, because EFTA was a reaction to not joining the European community in the first place. So I don't see EFTA being a step on the road back, but I think that's something for the trade policy wonks to have a good bash at. But initial thinking about that suggests that that's not a key way back. But we in the European movement are very much keen on a step-by-step approach back to membership. So just little bricks such as campaigns to get visas for musicians, campaigns to rejoin Erasmus. If we started in very small ways with small campaigns, if we eventually score a victory on what may be seemingly a small issue, which are obviously very serious to those immediately affected. But if we can get back into Erasmus, if we can get back to the visas for musicians, and I would point out I did work with David Frost way back when, and I do recall that his wife is an opera singer. I don't know if she's still performing, but I wonder if there seems to be no sign of David trying to get a visa for his wife. So maybe he wants to keep her home. I don't know, but I think we have to look at small little bricks in specific areas. Customs union, I think, is a lower hanging fruit. Much further on than we would be looking at single market. I mean, obviously, as Graham mentioned, single market involves being subject to ECJ rules, and it also poses the thorny issue, or at least what used to be the thorny issue of free movement of labor, and in global trade agreements, there does tend to be a trade-off between services and free movement of labor. So that'll be an issue for later on down the road. But I'm optimistic we will eventually get there, but it will be a long, hard slog.
Actually, Andy, I see.
Okay.
I see one of the questions about Russian oligarchs spending a load of money in the UK.
Yes.
I thought that actually touches on a very interesting point, this whole money laundering question. People talk about London being Moscow-on-Thames and so forth. I didn't have any knowledge about that at all. But I think something which will become quite relevant is there's a strong movement now against tax evasion by large companies. Let's talk about companies rather than individuals. The OECD is gearing up to look at how you can tax country by country. First of all, reporting. The EU has just enacted a piece of legislation to require country by country tax reporting. But depending on how you look at it, the OECD countries themselves are the biggest hosts of tax abuse, corporate tax abuses. But what is really striking for the UK is that there's an organization called the Tax Justice Network, and their corporate tax haven index has just been published. And they show that 68% of the world's corporate tax abuse risks are in the OECD countries and their dependencies. And their dependencies are actually half that. And the top three dependencies are the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and Bermuda. And Jersey comes a little further down the list. So to the extent that there is a move by countries generally, but certainly the EU, to try and clamp down on these sort of corporate tax abuses, some of these British territories are going to have quite a hard time. So the scope for money in London then being channeled to these countries and having a tax advantage, shall we say, I think that is going to get clamped down on. It's been a long time in the works, but I think the general feeling now seems to be developing. And of course, one of the countries which used to veto any question about this sort of thing was the UK. We're not at the table anymore.
I should declare an interest. I am a proud Jerseyman.
Oh, yes, of course, yes. Right.
And have written a great deal about Jersey. Jersey is an international financial centre. I'm very familiar with its business, and it doesn't involve Russian oligarchs. Its business is predominantly channeling money into the UK from Middle East and Asia, and they've taken massive steps to make sure they are fully compliant. That's their marketing line, is that we are highly regulated, and they work closely with other regulators. So a bit of defense for them. I commend Catherine Belton's book called Putin's People, about Russian oligarchs. I think she is just being sued by Roman Abramovich. That's a very interesting book. Yeah, there is, and quite properly, action being taken about tax evasion.
Yeah.
I think the Russian oligarch thing is rather different. It's not, the abuse there was giving large assets to friends of Putin. That's how they acquired the money. Now, what they then did with it was separate. But yeah, there is pressure both on corporates, and there is pressure on tax, on territories that deliberately run their tax system to attract or to help people evade tax. And the territories that do that are under pressure. But remember, within the European Union, the Netherlands and double Irish were significant, and Belgium. But of course, they're making the EU rules. And
they are actually losing out. That's the whole point, is this shift has is underway, and gradually the smaller countries are unable to stand the pressure of the larger countries wanting to see things cleaned up.
Correct.
When we get into the issue of money laundering, where do you see free ports actually standing in this area? Because we've just launched or announced the creation of 8 new ones, not always in the places where they were hoped to be, and they coincidentally seem to be in marginal Tory seats. But is that something that we should be concerned about in that context? And do they create jobs, or do they just move jobs from one place to another?
Well, I have no expertise in that field, so can't comment.
I don't.
Quite cynical.
But other people who do tend to say it's the latter. But where's the analysis that says how many jobs this is going to create, and how is it going to work?
Okay. Well, let's move on to a comment that says, I have heard that the EU is old world and the future is in Asia, and the city is creative, innovative, and fleet of foot. Of course, the Asian opportunities were always there from inside the EU, but being outside, maybe the motivation is higher to pursue these opportunities. Is this real, or a desperate search for something positive?
Well, I think the comment about these opportunities were always there from within the EU is absolutely true. I've never understood why it is that we had to leave the EU so that we could export half what the Germans do to China. Doesn't make sense. The other thing is that a lot of these countries, to the extent that the euro does rise in international importance, I'm not going to say rivals the dollar, but it becomes more and more of an international currency, then being backstopped by the central bank which issues it in the end, and the regulatory system which ensures it all works, and having the deposit base is a huge advantage. So if you're looking for the stability of organizations which are going to be trading in euro-denominated swaps, currencies, bonds, equities, etc., that is a tremendous advantage, which we of course don't have. So I don't see the advantage in being out to do something which we could have done anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to argue this in the Brexit debates. When we leave the European Union, we can export to China. I actually went to China a dozen times when I was leader of the city, trying to do 2 things: getting Chinese businesses to come to London, and trying to persuade the Chinese to allow British businesses into China. We were very successful on the first and very unsuccessful on the second. I think the question was about the EU being old. It's not the EU, it's Europe.
Well,
Europe is old world, not the EU. And China has become a massive, massive economic power. And it is using its economic power. It's using its power in regulatory bodies in a big way. That would apply whether we were in or out of the European Union. Yeah, there is some scope in Asia, but we're not as well placed as China, as Hong Kong or Shanghai or Singapore to be a major financial center in Asia. So there's already a lot of business. But the notion that because you have lost some business in Europe, you can therefore automatically get some profitable business somewhere in the world, the economy does not work like that. And remember, the business that's been lost has been lost by people like JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley and Citigroup. They haven't lost business.
Yep, exactly.
They've kept business. It's just less of it is being done from London and more being done from elsewhere. So of course we should look at Europe, at Asia. We always must have looked at Asia, but it should only be looked at if it's profitable, not to replace business.
But your point, Mark, that JP Morgan or whoever, nothing has gone wrong for them. For their London-based employees, that may be a different matter. And for the tax revenues they used to pay, perhaps still do at the moment in London, and for all of us, that's a problem. But the international firms which actually run the global financial system, they've not been hurt. They just moved and adapted, as they always will do.
We got a question about blockchain technology
Oh.
and its relevance to finance, and it says the role of city intermediaries is facing extermination this decade anyway, isn't it?
Well, I'm not an expert on blockchain by any means, but I read just last week about a Bank of America report that coins, Bitcoin included, now consume 0.4% of the world's entire electricity supply. How that can be sensible as a long-term thing, I have no idea. What use is a blockchain, is a Bitcoin? I mean, how do you actually use it? You can't. But what the central banks are doing, and the ECB is at the forefront of this, or well ahead, is developing central bank digital currencies, which will be profoundly transformative of the financial system in ways we can't yet see. But without doubt, that's where the transformation will come, not, I suspect, from blockchain itself. That's incredibly consumptive of electricity.
And you see that as being developed more inside the EU than in the UK?
Well, they've got the big population, the big financial market. They can use it. Whereas if we had a sterling blockchain, a sterling Bitcoin, sterling, I can't remember the size of it now in international transactions, but it's 4 or 5%, whereas the euro is 30 and the dollar is somewhat over 50. That's just orders of magnitude. So that's something where I don't see what will be the special interest or the special leitmotif of a sterling digital currency.
Can I distinguish
Yeah.
blockchain from Bitcoin? Blockchain has got a lot of applications. I've been trying to understand blockchain, and every time I try and read something, I find something more interesting to read. It is very complex, but basically, central bank digital currencies are coming. China is leading the way. The Bank of England is very well advanced on this. But what it means is that you don't need an account with a bank. You simply have your account with the central bank. And you pay people by transferring ownership of money with the central bank. This has rather significant implications for commercial banks.
Absolutely. Yeah. But again, the EU has just enacted the retail strategy. So you now have soon we'll have instant retail payments in euro. If you have that, what's the point of a digital currency? It's private money through a bank. If you can have exactly the same thing, instant retail payments through ECB money, through your ECB account, probably you might be willing to hold your money in the ECB unless the commercial bank pays you over the odds for it. And then the profitability question comes into play. So there are some huge ramifications from that which go way beyond the Brexit question. This is financial technology in action. And it is going to change the world in the next 2 years, 5 years or so.
Let's move on to green finance, which is a subject dear to my heart. Is there anything positive to say about the city in relation to the global foreign exchange market, or as a centre for green finance, or fintech of SPACs, or is this just back to fish? Is this just codswallop?
Right. Well, I won't say anything about SPACs. I can't understand why people would just hand their money over to someone to gamble with it. But yes, I forgot what I was going to say there about the what was the first point you were making? Not about fish, but
green finance, fintech.
Green finance.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and the EU has made a huge effort and is having substantial success to develop the green finance rules. So the green bonds, trying to have rules against greenwashing, that's called the taxonomy. That's all coming through and coming into force. The accounting standards which go with that, the non-financial reporting directive, and all these standards are driven by the EU, and they're being forced, they're not forced on European companies, some of them wish to adopt it. But the real driver for this green finance is the EU. Now, there's no reason at all in principle, why green bonds shouldn't be issued and traded in London, denominated in euro or sterling for that matter. But it's the greenness of it is going to be set by EU standards, which are rapidly well on the way to becoming global standards.
Could be rather more optimistic. I think fintech, we are the market leader.
Yes, yes.
And I think we can keep a lot of that if we have sensible policies on immigration, and also the sort of changes that Lord Hill has suggested on listing rules. And a point that came up in a conference I've been at for the last few days, the Competition and Markets Authority has just stopped a merger between two rapidly growing fintechs. And you have to think, why? That's what rapidly growing companies do. So there's quite a few things we need to do to make sure we can keep the fintech industry. I think we've done really well on green finance. My old friend and colleague Roger Gifford is leading that for the city. You know, we were first into doing a lot of this work, and of course we must be doing all of that. And I think there is absolutely scope to expand that work. One of the issues that's come up very much at this conference I've been at the last few days is about standards. Graham talked about greenwashing. There's also ESG washing.
Yep.
That is, you outsource your nasty things. I'm reminded of my good friends in Guernsey, and I do come from Jersey, who said they have a very low carbon footprint because they import their electricity from France and their planes refuel in Southampton, which I thought was a wonderful example of greenwashing. And there's a real concern about standards on ESG. There's about 40. I'm not certain I agree with Graham that the EU will take the lead on this. I think we've got American standards, global standards that the Chinese will influence, British standards, EU standards, and what business wants is a standard. And it's not clear where that is going to come from.
Well, actually, I think
sorry, Graham, go on.
Yeah, when you look at the Global Regulatory Institute and all these various standard-setting bodies, in the past few months, I think about 5 of them have come together and said they're going to cooperate. The International Financial Standards Board is probably going to announce at COP26 at the end of the year, they're going to set up the equivalent to accounting standards with green standards. So this is coming together quite quickly. But the role of the EU in stimulating this can't be underestimated. A lot of the basic grunt work is EU stuff, which is then being adopted elsewhere. Of course, a lot comes from the States and so on, but where I don't think much of it comes from the UK. That's my concern.
I think a point to add to that, and I made it in my Centre for European Reform paper some years ago, out of the European Union, we need to massively expand our financial diplomacy work. I think we've got outstanding officials, outstanding civil servants who did a great job in the European Union. We did write most of the European legislation that we now seem to dislike. And I think the officials are absolutely brilliant. And equally, we've had fantastic MEPs who've done a terrific job for us. We now need to spend a lot of time and money on financial diplomacy, beef up what we do in the Basel Committee, in the international, in IOSCO, in the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, the Financial Stability Board. We need to have diplomats working on this in Washington, in New York, in Singapore, in Tokyo, in Beijing, because that's how we now have our influence, rather than what we used to do is dominate the European Union.
Yes, and the EU is so much bigger in each of those bodies. If we can shape the EU view, you shape the body's view.
I mean, we had the benefit of having our view being presented as the European Union view.
But not anymore. I mean, after all, we started talking about the insurance. I think it was Nick's question about Solvency II. We conveniently forget now that Solvency II was largely a British invention, much to the disgust of some of the mutual life insurance companies. That's where it came from.
Yeah, I was running the ABI at the time.
Ah, yes.
And I can remember having chats with John Mogg, who I think was then Director General of the Commission. Yeah, it was a British invention. You know, almost all the European insurance stuff was British because the other countries recognized on technicalities we were the best. And then our officials were brilliant, and so were the MEPs, and making sure that even where there were divergences of opinion on big issues, and generally the French were against us and the Germans, we got our way because we built alliances with the Dutch, with the Irish, with the Nordic countries. That's how we did so well in the European Union. And when I was running trade bodies, that's what I did. Those were my alliances.
All gone.
Yeah, well, I think both parties have lost, really, haven't they? And that's the tragedy of the whole thing. Let's take one more question, and then I'll just have a little round robin at the end for some final thoughts. And this is actually from one of our London for Europe committee members, Keith Best. It's quite nice. There has been some speculation about a merger agreement bringing the city and Amsterdam closer together, in effect as a joint enterprise. How realistic is that, and what would the advantages and demerits be?
Well, I've not heard of that, but I have to say the idea that you need physical centres must surely, post-COVID, be up for some questioning. I have to say, when I joined the city a few years ago, a firm of stockbrokers, you had to have your office within 400 yards of the stock exchange, because you had to be able to walk around with bits of paper which were called gilts and bits of paper called checks, etc., to settle. That's all been blown away for several decades. And now where your physical location is even less relevant. So the idea of forming an alliance with another city, the City of London is not going to be replaced by another single centre. There will be different specialities, just as in the old days, the insurance industry was around Lime Street. It now seems to be in Luxembourg. Fund management industry, maybe it was EC2, now it's in Dublin, etc. So there are concentrations by speciality, but not total. But there's no need to reinvent a physical set of buildings like the City of London, as I've got behind me. You have Canary Wharf, and you have got the Bank of England there. On the right, you've got the Grand Arch at La Défense. You don't need those physical buildings to the same extent. You will still need some, I have no doubt. But this is going to be a new, COVID has created an accelerator, a dramatic accelerator to this whole process. Where it will go, I don't know. But therefore, the idea of cities linking up, and in the end, the city of Amsterdam will be obliged to operate, or the Dutch regulators will be obliged to operate EU law there. So if you have a firm which is set up there as a sort of two-centre firm, the bit that's in Amsterdam will respond to the Dutch police if they transgress.
I think there's a very interesting point here. Regulators, quite properly in the past, have wanted the substance of a company to be where it is regulated. I mean, the notion that we had in some of the early Brexit debates that we'll carry on in London and send two men and a dog to Paris and have a brass plate, that was never ever going to happen, because we wouldn't allow that in Britain, and nor should we.
Yeah.
Remember BCCI,
yeah.
And that was the problem. So regulators have wanted substance. The EU has been very pragmatic on substance. It said, you can't just move your head office. You have to move the substance. We will want to see the management in Berlin or in Bonn or in Paris, but we're not stupid. This can't be done overnight. You can do it over the next 4 or 5 years. But what COVID has done is raised a very interesting question, because in the past, people did work in a city. That is no longer the case. I'm on calls with people. I'm the managing director of a British bank, and I've been working from California for the last year. How do regulators cope with that? And it'll mean, for example, for Britain, that some of the bankers who previously were thinking they would have to physically move might now be able to stay in Britain. And that then raises very difficult personal taxation issues, which regulator or tax authorities have not got to grips with. What do you do if you're working entirely for a French bank based in Paris, but you're in London all the time? Where you pay your tax?
Well, will the regulators permit that? Because in the end, if you want to have a dawn raid on somebody's office, and go round and seize their computers and their records and them and take them away in handcuffs. If they're in another country, you can't do that. It's another country, you could arrange for it in the EU. You can arrange for the German police to represent you. But if a crowd of gendarmes turn up in London to arrest somebody, there are rules about that sort of thing. It's an invasion. So it throws up a lot of issues, which I'm sure the answer is not going to be that individuals will be allowed to be non-resident, non-physically located in the place where they're meant to be exercising managerial responsibility.
But Graham, what about somebody now who's running an institution in London from their country cottage in Devon?
Well, the Devon police can still pop round there at the behest of the Met. And the legal system in the UK makes that possible because it's all the same, in the end, the same jurisdiction. But if he's running that from his country cottage in Jersey, country cottage in France, now, different matter entirely. I mean, in the end, the power of the state is a physical one. It may not be used very much, but people do get arrested and taken away and put in front of a court. How do you do that if they're not physically present in your country?
But Graham, one of the people on the call earlier today with me has just taken on a top job with a British company, and he's been in California for the last year because he can't get to Britain. That happens now. And there's some very difficult issues arising from this.
Yes. Which we've only begun to scratch at.
Yeah.
Right. What's happened to Andy? Is he?
I like the question, the notion of a country is outdated.
Yes. Right. Well, let me just have a quick comment. Fascinating discussion, lots of very interesting questions. I think my regret is that I've not been able to answer the person who said, can't you think of something positive? I'd love to, but I'm afraid my imagination has failed me. So I hope that's helped people just by showing some of the issues which are around, some of the complete fantasies which are being talked about. I'm sure when the MOU with the EU comes out, the Daily Telegraph will report it as a great triumph and so forth. But if you actually read it, that may reveal that there's not much content. This is so often the case with all these European things. Read the text, you suddenly realize that you're in a very different world than that of the Daily Telegraph.
Well, thanks to Graham and Mark for all your contributions, and Nick. I think it's been a very worthwhile evening. Certainly, I've just had to sit back and listen to all this discussion, and I'm not familiar with the city or economics. I try to get my head around it when I can, but certainly there's a lot of food for thought there, even to a layman like myself. So thank you once again, Graham and Mark and Nick. Can I just push again? 26th of April, Monday the 26th, London for Europe's AGM with Catherine West and Andrew Adonis. So I wish you all a good evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And don't forget, we're looking towards organising another webinar in May, hopefully late May or early June. Okay, all the best to you. Take care and keep safe. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.